Hello and welcome to Marple's Mind, where every story feels like a conversation. Over a warm cup of coffee today, I bring you a brand new Miss Marple mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in. From now, let's get started. Miss Marple, who killed the wealthy widow? The answer will shock you. Chapter 1. The Widow's Will. The village of St. Mary Mead was not accustomed to commotion, but that crisp March morning in 2025, it hummed with a restless energy. Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne, the wealthiest widow in living memory, had been found dead in her sprawling manor at the edge of the village. Word spread faster than the spring breeze, rustling through the hedgerows and into the tea-room where Miss Jane Marple sat with her knitting. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her hands steady despite the chatter around her. She wore her usual tweed skirt and a pale lavender cardigan, her white hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat. To the untrained eye, she was just another elderly spinster sipping tea, but her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. She listened as Mrs. Finch, the postmistress, leaned across the table with a conspiratorial whisper. "They say she was worth a fortune, Miss Marple. Land, jewels, and a bank account to make your head spin. And now it's all up for grabs. The will's being read tomorrow at Hawthorne Manor. Half the village expects a windfall, and the other half's just nosy." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles pausing. "Money does stir people up, doesn't it? Poor Mrs. Hawthorne. I suppose we'll soon see who she thought worthy of her riches." Mrs. Finch nodded eagerly. "Oh, it's bound to be a scene. That nephew of hers, Rupert, has been lounging about the manor for weeks, acting like he's already lord of the place. And then there's the staff. Cook's been muttering about unpaid wages, and the gardener swears he saw someone sneaking round the back gate last week. Did he now?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her mind filed the detail away. She'd known Eleanor Hawthorne only in passing, a proud, solitary woman who'd moved to St. Mary Mead 5 years ago after her husband's death. She'd kept her distance, her wealth a quiet rumour until now, her sudden demise discovered by the milkman when he found her slumped in her armchair had sparked more curiosity than grief. The official word was heart failure. Natural, they said. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that nature often had a helping hand in such matters. She'd heard something else that morning too, a tidbit from young Sally at the bakery. Mrs. Hawthorne had been planning to change her will. "She told me herself," Sally had said, flower-dusted and wide-eyed. "Said she'd had a falling out and wanted to set things right." Miss Marple took a sip of her tea, the cup warm against her fingers. A falling out, a fortune at stake, and a death just in time to stop the change. Coincidence, perhaps, or perhaps not. She glanced out the tea-room window towards the manor's distant chimneys, half hidden by budding trees. Tomorrow's will reading would be more than a spectacle. It might just be the key to unravelling a puzzle no one else had noticed yet. She set her cup down and resumed her knitting. "Well," she murmured to herself, "we shall see what we shall see." Chapter 2. A Gathering at the Manor. The next day Hawthorne Manor loomed grand and sombre under a sky heavy with clouds. Its ivy-clad walls and tall windows seemed to watch the procession of villagers trickling through the iron gates, their curiosity cloaked in respectful murmurs. Miss Marple arrived on foot, her sensible shoes crunching the gravel drive, a black shawl draped over her shoulders for the occasion. She'd been invited, not officially, of course, but Dolly Bantry had insisted. "She come along. You've a nose for these things, Jane," Dolly had said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. Inside, the drawing room was a hive of hushed voices and shifting glances. The furniture gleamed with polish, and a portrait of Mrs. Hawthorne gazed down from above the fireplace, stern, silver-haired and faintly disapproving. Miss Marple settled into a corner chair, her knitting bag at her feet, and took stock of the assembly. Rupert Hawthorne, the widow's nephew, lounged near the hearth, his dark hair tousled and his tie askew. He was handsome in a careless way, mid-30s, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He twirled a cigarette between his fingers, ignoring the solicitor's attempts to call order. Beside him stood Clara Brent, a distant cousin, her sharp features pinched with impatience. She wore a navy dress too elegant for the occasion, her gloved hands clasped tightly as if holding herself together. The staff hovered at the edges. Mrs. Pym, the stout cook, dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, though Miss Marple noted they were dry, and Tom Grayson, the wiry gardener, shifted uncomfortably in his Sunday best, his knuckles scarred from years of toil. Then there was Lily, the young maid, barely 19, her pale face half hidden by a mop of brown curls. She lingered near the door, twisting her apron in her hands, her eyes darting to Rupert and away again. Mr. Pettigrew, the solicitor, cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here to read the last will and testament of Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne, dated January 15th, 2025. The room stilled, all eyes on the thin sheaf of papers in his hands. He began, the manor and its grounds to Rupert, a generous sum to Clara, modest bequests to the staff, and, unexpectedly, a sizable donation to the St. Mary Mead Library Fund. A ripple of surprise passed through the group, and Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. Mrs. Hawthorne hadn't, struck her as the philanthropic sort. Clara's voice cut through the silence, sharp as a blade. "The library? What nonsense! She never cared a whit for books. She must have been out of her mind." Rupert smirked, exhaling smoke. "Oh, come off it, Clara. You've got your share. Maybe she wanted to leave a legacy instead of just fattening." "Your purse? Easy for you to say," Clara snapped, "with the house and half the estate in your pocket. She always favoured you, the spoiled brat." Miss Marple watched the exchange, her fingers idle on her lap. Tension crackled like static, and she noted how Lily flinched at the raised voices, her apron now a crumpled knot. Mrs. Pym muttered something about ungrateful lot, while Tom Grayson stared at the floor, his jaw tight. Mr. Pettigrew coughed, again clearly eager to escape the brewing storm. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze settling on a small silver tray on the sideboard. It held a single teacup, its saucer stained with a faint brown ring. Odd, she thought, for a room so meticulously tidied. She filed it away, a tiny thread in the tapestry she was beginning to weave. Something about this gathering, its bitterness, its secrets, felt heavier than mere greed. And Miss Marple had a knack for sensing when the surface hid a deeper truth. Chapter 3. The Fatal Evening. The night Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne died had been unseasonably cold, even for late March. A thin frost glittered on the windows of Hawthorne Manor, and the wind rattled the shutters as if impatient to get inside. Miss Marple hadn't been there, of course, but she'd pieced together the evening from fragments. Gossip from the milkman, a stray comment from Dolly Bantry, and now, as she sat knitting that afternoon, her mind wandered back to imagine it. Inside the manor, the drawing-room glowed with the flicker of a dying fire. Mrs. Hawthorne sat in her high-backed armchair, a shawl draped over her shoulders, her silver hair catching the light. She'd been alone, or so it seemed, sipping tea from a delicate china cup, her lips pursed as if the brew displeased her. The clock on the mantel ticked toward 9, its rhythm steady against the wind's howls. Earlier that evening, Rupert had been there, sprawled on the sofa with a glass of brandy he'd helped himself to from her cabinet. "You ought to ease up on the purse strings, Aunt Eleanor," he'd said, his tone teasing but edged with something harder. "I could do wonders with a bit more cash." She'd fixed him with a steely look, her voice low. "You'll get what you deserve, Rupert, and not a penny more until I'm gone." He'd laughed, but it hadn't reached his eyes, and soon after he'd stormed out, muttering about a poker game in the village. Clara had visited too earlier, still, her heels clicking on the polished floor as she pleaded her case. "You've no idea how tight things are for me," she'd said, her hands twisting a silk handkerchief. "A little advance on my share, it's only fair." Mrs. Hawthorne had waved her off. "Fairness isn't charity, Clara. You'll wait like the rest." Clara had left in a huff, her parting glance sharp enough to cut glass. The staff had been about too. Mrs. Pym had brought in a tray of scones, unwanted as it turned out, for Mrs. Hawthorne sent them back untouched. Tom Grayson had been outside, pruning the hedges by lantern light, claiming the frost wouldn't wait. And Lily, poor, nervous Lily, had darted in to stoke the fire, her hands trembling as she dropped a log, earning a sharp rebuke from her mistress. "Clumsy girl," Mrs. Hawthorne had snapped. "Mind you don't break something next time." By 9, the house was quiet, the visitors gone, the staff retreated to their quarters. The milkman, delivering at dawn, would later say he'd seen no lights, no movement, just Mrs. Hawthorne slumped in her chair, cold as the frost outside, the teacup tipped over on the carpet beside her. The doctor called it heart failure, blaming her age and a weak constitution. But Miss Marple, picturing it now, lingered on that teacup, spilled, not placed. And the tray in the drawing-room yesterday had held just one. Where was its pair? Or small thing, perhaps, but small things often mattered. She paused her knitting, her needles still. The evening had been a tangle of tempers and departures, each leaving a thread to tug. Rupert's greed, Clara's desperation, Lily's fear. Something had snapped that night, and Mrs. Hawthorne's heart hadn't failed on its own. Miss Marple was sure of it. She'd need more than village whispers to prove it, but the picture was taking shape, one stitch at a time. Chapter 4. The Curious Nephew. The sun broke through the clouds on Wednesday morning, casting a weak glow over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple stood at her garden gate, pruning shears in hand, though her attention wasn't on the roses. Across the lane, Rupert Hawthorne roared by in his sleek black car, a flashy thing, all chrome and curves, far too grand for the village's narrow roads. He waved carelessly as he passed, his grin wide, but Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. She'd seen that sort of cheer before, and it rarely meant good news. Rupert had been a fixture at Hawthorne Manor since the will reading, strutting about as if the place were already his. Dolly Bantry had spotted him the day before, hauling a crate of champagne into the house. "Celebrating, I suppose," she'd huffed over tea. "The woman's not cold in her grave, and he's popping corks." Miss Marple had nodded, saying little, but her mind turned it over. Champagne was one thing, the speed of it was another. She decided to take a stroll past the manor that afternoon, her shawl snug against the lingering chill. The gates were open, and there was Rupert in the drive, polishing his car with a rag and a whistle on his lips. He wore a tailored jacket, a shade too tight, and his shoes shone like mirrors. Up close, his charm was undeniable. Dark eyes that crinkled at the corners, a voice smooth as honey. But Miss Marple knew charm could hide a multitude of sins. "Good day, Mr. Hawthorne," she called, pausing at the gate with her mildest smile. "Settling in, are you?" He straightened, tossing the rag aside. "Oh, hello, Miss Marple, isn't it? Yes, well, no sense letting the place gather dust. Aunt Eleanor would have wanted it lived in, don't you think?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "She did seem fond of order. I imagine. It's quite a change, managing such an estate." Rupert laughed a touch too loud. "Manage? I'll leave that to the lawyers and the help. I'm more the enjoying type." He winked, but his fingers drummed against the car's hood. A restless little dance. Miss Marple noticed the faint tremor in them. Nerves, perhaps, or something stronger. She'd seen young men like him before, all swagger until the bills came due. "You've plans, then?" she asked, tilting her head. "The manners are fine. Prize?" "Oh, big plans," he said, leaning closer, his breath tinged with tobacco. "Sell off some land, maybe, fix up the old pile. Aunt Eleanor sat on a gold mine and never knew it. Me, I'll make it sing." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to a smudge on his cuff, a dark, oily streak, not from car polish. "Ambitious," she murmured, though I dare say she knew its worth. She was sharp, your aunt. His grin faltered, just for a heartbeat, then snapped back. "Sharp as a tack, sure. Too bad it didn't save her ticker." He tapped his chest, then turned back to the car, dismissing her with a casual, "Well, cheers, Miss Marple. Duty calls." She watched him go, her shears idle in her hand. Rupert was a puzzle, bold yet brittle, his confidence a thin veneer. That tremor, that smudge, the haste of his celebration, it all nagged at her. He stood to gain the most, true, but gain could drive a man to folly as easily as triumph. And folly, in Miss Marple's experience, often left tracks. She'd keep an eye on him, this curious nephew, for he was dancing too close to the edge of something dark. Chapter 5. Shadows in the Garden. The moon hung low over St. Mary Mead that Thursday night, its light filtering through the skeletal branches of Hawthorne Manor's garden. Miss Marple had taken to evening walks lately, her insomnia a convenient excuse to ponder the widow's death. Tonight, her steps led her past the manor's wrought-iron gates, left ajar as if inviting her in. She hesitated, then slipped through, her shawl drawn tight against the damp air. Something about the place pulled at her. A hunch, perhaps, or just the stillness that felt too heavy. The garden was Mrs. Hawthorn's pride, a maze of rose bushes and neatly trimmed boxwoods, though neglect had crept in since her passing. Miss Marple moved softly along the stone path, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. The roses, still budding, gave off a faint, sweet scent. But there was another smell too, something sharper, acrid, like burnt metal. She paused near a trellis, her gaze drawn to a patch of earth beneath it. There, half buried in the soil, glinted a shard of glass. Not a bottle or a jar, but something finer, curved with a jagged edge, catching the moonlight like a broken promise. Miss Marple knelt, careful not to touch it, and peered closer. Beside it, the dirt was scuffed as if someone had kicked it over in haste. A few paces away, a single rose lay trampled, its petals bruised and dark against the gravel. She straightened, her mind ticking. Glass in a garden was odd. Mrs. Hawthorn had been fastidious, scolding Tom Grayson for so much as a stray leaf. This wasn't his doing, not with those scarred hands so steady at the will-reading. And the smell, faint but distinct, reminded her of a chemist's shop, not a gardener's shed. She glanced toward the manor, its windows black and silent. Whoever had been here hadn't wanted to be seen. A rustle broke her thoughts, and she turned sharply. A shadow darted behind the hedge, too quick to identify, but human, not animal. Miss Marple held her breath, her heart steady despite the hour. The figure didn't reappear, and after a moment the night settled back into quiet. She marked the spot in her memory, the trellis by the red climbers, third from the gate, and resolved to return in daylight, for now she'd seen enough. She made her way home. The shard nagged at her. Not a teacup, no, that was another thread, from the drawing-room and the fatal night. This was different, deliberate, a piece of something broken and hidden. Poison, perhaps? She'd heard of such things, vials of liquid, colourless and deadly, discarded after use. Or maybe it was simpler, a tool of some kind, dropped in panic. Either way, it was a crack in the case, and Miss Marple knew cracks widened with a little pressure. Back in her cottage, she lit a lamp and sat with her knitting, though her needles lay still. The garden held secrets, and that shadow, nervous, fleeting, suggested someone else knew it too. Tomorrow she'd find a way to poke about properly. For now, she let the pieces settle in her mind, like yarn waiting to be wound. Chapter 6. The Vicar's Tale. Friday morning dawned soft and grey, a mist clinging to St. Mary Mead like a shroud. Miss Marple made her way to the church, her basket swinging lightly on her arm. She'd promised the vicar, Mr. Clement, a jar of her blackberry jam, a small courtesy, though she admitted to herself it was also a chance to chat. Vicars, she'd found, often knew more than they let on, their ears attuned to the village's quiet confessions. Mr. Clement greeted her at the vestry door, his round face creasing into a smile. "Miss Marple, what a treat! Come in, come in! The kettle's just boiled." He was a gentle soul, nearing 60, with a habit of tugging his collar when flustered. They settled in his cramped study, the air thick with the scent of old books and damp stone. Over tea, talk turned to Mrs. Hawthorn's death, as it inevitably did these days. Such a shock, Mr. Clement said, stirring his cup. She wasn't one for services, mind you, but she'd send a cheque now and then. Generous in her way. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the steam curling from her tea. Generous, yes. That library bequest surprised many, though. Did she ever mention it to you? He shook his head, then paused, his spoon clinking against the saucer. Not directly, no, but, oh, it's a silly thing, really. Something came to mind the other day. A story from years back, before she came here. I'd nearly forgotten. Go on, Miss Marple urged, her tone soft but insistent. Well, he began, tugging his collar. It was when I was curate in Little Hampton, must have been 20 years ago. There was a woman, Mrs. Langley her name was, who caused quite a stir. Widowed, wealthy, much like Mrs. Hawthorn. She'd promised her fortune to a nephew, but then, out of the blue, left it all to a school for orphans. Family was furious, claimed she'd been coerced. There was talk of poison, too, though nothing came of it. She died sudden-like, and the coroner said it was natural. Still, the whispers lingered. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her cup. And you think Mrs. Hawthorn knew of this? Mr. Clement shrugged. Could be. Little Hampton's not far, 30 miles or so. And Mrs. Hawthorn did ask me once, years ago when she first arrived, if I'd ever served there. Seemed an odd question at the time. I told her yes, and she changed the subject quick, as you please. How curious, Miss Marple murmured, her mind already spinning. A parallel case. Wealth, a sudden will change, whispers of foul play. Mrs. Hawthorn might have known Mrs. Langley, or heard the tale, and it had planted a seed. That library bequest, so out of character, echoed the orphan's school. Had she feared a similar fate? Or had someone feared she'd repeat it? She set her cup down, smiling faintly. Thank you, Mr. Clement. That's a most interesting story. Memories do have a way of popping up, don't they? He chuckled, oblivious to the wheels turning behind her calm facade. They do indeed. Just a bit of old gossip, I suppose. But to Miss Marple, it was more than gossip. It was a thread, thin and frayed, stretching back to a past that might illuminate the present. As she left the church, the mist parting before her, she wondered if Mrs. Hawthorn's death was an echo of Mrs. Langley's, or a deliberate reprise. Either way, the vicar's tale had given her something new to tug at, and she intended to pull until it unravelled. Chapter 7. Tea and Suspicions. The afternoon sun slanted through the lace curtains of Dolly Bantry's sitting room, painting delicate shadows on the carpet. Miss Marple sat across from her old friend, a tray of scones and a steaming teapot between them. Dolly, ever the enthusiast for a good story, had insisted on a catch-up, her eyes bright with the thrill of village drama. Jane, you've been poking about that Hawthorn business, haven't you? She said, slathering jam on a scone. I knew you couldn't resist. Miss Marple smiled, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Oh, I've only been listening, Dolly. People do talk, and I find it hard not to hear. Well, they're talking. Plenty, Dolly said, leaning forward. I was at the butcher's yesterday, and Mrs. Finch, she's got ears like a bat. Said Clara Brent's been seen in town, buying expensive hats. Hats, Jane. With what money, I'd like to know. Share from the wills tied up in probate, and she's never had 2 shillings to rub together. Interesting, Miss Marple murmured, her mind noting the detail. Clara's sharp words at the will reading had hinted at desperation, not sudden wealth. New hats suggested either confidence or a reckless bluff. And that's not all, Dolly went on, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. Tom Grayson, the gardener, was in the pub last night, drunk as a lord, kept muttering about knowing too much and keeping his mouth shut. Old Mr. Potts had to haul him home. What do you make of that? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Tom had been quiet at the manor, his scarred hands steady, but the garden shard from her late-night walk flashed in her memory. He's a man of few words, usually, she said. Drink can loosen a tongue or tangle it. I wonder what he knows. Dolly nodded, then took a triumphant bite of her scone. And Lily, that little maid, saw her myself this morning, scurrying out of the chemist's with a parcel under her arm. Looked like she'd seen a ghost. What's a girl like that need from there, eh? A parcel? Miss Marple tilted her head, the acrid scent from the garden lingering in her thoughts. The chemists sold all manner of things, liniments, tonics, even pest powders. Lily's nerves had been plain from the start, but this was a new twist. She's a timid thing, she said aloud. Perhaps it's nothing, or perhaps it's everything. Dolly laughed, brushing crumbs from her lap. You're a marvel, Jane. You sit there all prim and proper, and I'll bet you've got half the puzzle sorted already. What about Rupert? He's been swaggering about like a peacock. Heard he's ordered a new motorbike to match that car of his. Has he? Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her mind sharpened. Rupert's spending spree, champagne, a bike, outpaced even his inheritance's promise. Confidence, like Clara's, or something else? That oily smudge on his cuff flickered in her recollection, a detail yet to fit. She sipped her tea, letting Dolly's chatter wash over her. Each snippet was a pebble, dropped into the still pool of her thoughts, sending ripples outward. Clara's hats, Tom's drunken ramblings, Lily's parcel, Rupert's extravagance. They didn't align yet, but they would. People's habits, she knew, betrayed them as surely as footprints in mud. And this tea had given her plenty to tread through. As she rose to leave, Dolly called after her, "You'll tell me when you crack it, won't you?" Miss Marple only smiled. She'd tell Dolly in time, but first she'd need to see where these pebbles led. Chapter 8. The Locked Room. Riddle Saturday morning brought a bustle to St. Mary Mead, as Inspector Slack arrived from Much Benham with his usual air of brisk efficiency. Miss Marple watched from her window as his car pulled up outside the post office, his square jaw set and his hat tilted just so. She'd dealt with him before, competent but impatient, prone to seeing what was obvious and missing what wasn't. By noon, word reached her that he'd been to Hawthorne Manor and declared the case closed. Heart failure, he'd said. No foul play. Naturally, she wasn't convinced. She found him later at the village hall, scribbling notes for his report. "Good day, Inspector," she said, approaching with her basket and a disarming smile. "I hear you've settled Mrs. Hawthorne's matter." Slack looked up, his pencil pausing. "Miss Marple, yes, it's done. Simple enough. Old lady, weak, heart keeled over in her chair. No marks, no struggle. Door locked from the inside, key still in it, open and shut. He tapped his notebook for emphasis, clearly eager to be off. Locked from the inside, she echoed, her tone thoughtful. How interesting. And the windows? Bolted, everyone, he said, a touch smug. Checked myself. No one in, no one out. Doctor's report matches. Died around 9. Natural causes. Waste of my time, frankly. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting past him to the hall's dusty chandelier. Very thorough, though I suppose the teacup puzzled you. The one spilled by her chair. Slack frowned, caught off guard. Spilled? Well, yes, the milkman mentioned it. Clumsy old woman, probably dropped it when she felt faint. What's that got to do with anything? Oh, nothing, perhaps, she said lightly. Only Mrs. Hawthorne wasn't clumsy. Quite the opposite. She'd scold her maid for a speck of dust. Odd she'd let a cup fall and not ring for it to be cleared. He shifted, irritation creeping in. People get shaky when they're dying, Miss Marple. It's not a mystery. Of course, she agreed, her smile unwavering. And the key, still, in the lock, you say? No chance it was turned from outside? Slack snorted. With what, a magic wand? It's a solid door, no gaps, no tricks. I've seen locked room cases. This isn't one. You're chasing shadows. Shadows can be telling, she murmured more to herself than to him. She thanked him and left, her mind already turning over the riddle. A locked room, a spilled teacup, a death too tidy for a woman so precise. Slack saw a closed case. Yahe saw a closed door with a secret behind it. Back at her cottage, she sat by the fire, her knitting untouched. The key in the lock nagged at her. Not its presence, but its position. She'd once read of a trick. Thread or wire slipped through a keyhole, turning a key from outside, then pulled free. Possible here. The manor's old doors might allow it, though she'd need to see for herself. And that teacup, spilled not, dropped, as if knocked in haste or surprise. Slack's open and shut felt more like a lid slammed shut on something unfinished. She leaned back, the firelight dancing in her eyes. The room was locked, yes, but locks could lie. And Miss Marple had a way of opening what others swore was sealed. Chapter 9. A servant's secret Sunday afternoon cast a gentle hush over St. Mary Mead, the church bells fading into a stillness that suited Miss Marple's mood. She'd been mulling the locked room all morning, but her thoughts kept circling, back to Lily, the timid maid with the darting eyes and twisted apron. Dolly's mention of her at the chemist's had stuck, a burr in Miss Marple's mind. So, after lunch, she took her basket, ostensibly to deliver a spare skein of wool to the manor's cook, and set off. She found Lily alone in the manor's scullery, scrubbing a pot with a ferocity that belied her slight frame. The girl started at Miss Marple's soft knock, her hands slipping on the wet iron. "Oh, Miss Marple!" she gasped, her face paling. "I didn't hear you." "No need to fret, my dear," Miss Marple said, stepping inside with her kindest smile. "I only brought something for Mrs. Pym. Is she about?" Lily shook her head, wiping her hands on her apron. "No, ma'am. She's gone to the market. It's just me till supper." Her voice trembled, and she glanced at the door as if expecting it to burst open. Miss Marple set her basket down, her gaze soft but steady. "You look troubled, Lily. It's a hard time, I know, with Mrs. Hawthorne gone. Were you fond of her?" The girl bit her lip, her curls falling into her eyes. She was strict, ma'am. Fair mostly, but sharp. I tried to please her. Her hands twisted together, and Miss Marple noticed a faint red mark on her wrist, like a burn or a scratch. Strictness can wear on a person, Miss Marple said gently. I imagine you saw a great deal working here, things others might miss. Lily's eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed to shrink. Then, in a rush, as if the words had been clawing to escape, she whispered, I did see something, ma'am, that night she died. I shouldn't have, but I did. Miss Marple leaned closer, her voice a murmur. What did you see, child? Lily swallowed, her breath ragged. I'd gone to bed, but I forgot my cap in the drawing-room. Went back quiet-like. Past 9 it was. The door was shut, but I heard voices, hers and a man's, low, angry. Then a clatter, like something fell. I didn't dare go in. I ran back upstairs. Next morning she was dead. A man's voice, Miss Marple repeated, her mind racing. Could you tell who? No, ma'am, Lily said, shaking her head fiercely. It was muffled and I was scared. I've not told a soul till now. Thought they'd blame me for not speaking up. But it's been eating me alive. Miss Marple patted her arm, her touch light but firm. You've done right to tell me, Lily. No one will blame you. Keep this between us for now, It's safer that way. Lily nodded, tears brimming, and Miss Marple left her to her scrubbing, the skein of wool forgotten on the table. Outside the air felt sharper, the pieces shifting in her head. A man in the locked room, a clatter, perhaps the teacup, after Rupert and Clara had supposedly left. Slacks, no one in, no one out, crumbled under this. Was it Tom, with his drunken mutterings? Rupert, back from his poker game? Or another, yet unseen? She walked home slowly, the red mark on Lily's wrist lingering in her thoughts. Fear could mark a person as surely as guilt. Lily's secret wasn't the answer, but it was a key, one that might just unlock the room Slack had sealed shut. Chapter 10. The Shocking Truth. Monday evening settled over Hawthorne Manor like a held breath. The drawing-room aglow with lamplight as Miss Marple gathered the suspects. Rupert lounged by the hearth, his grin cocky but strained. Clara sat rigid, her new hat perched defiantly on her head. Tom Grayson slouched near the window, his eyes bloodshot. Lily hovered by the door, apron clutched tight, and Mrs. Pym stood stout and sour-faced, arms crossed. Inspector Slack, summoned reluctantly at Miss Marple's insistence, leaned against the wall, arms folded, his scepticism plain. "Thank you for coming," Miss Marple began, her voice calm as she stood by the fireplace, her knitting bag at her feet. "I've asked you here because Mrs. Hawthorne's death wasn't what it seemed. It wasn't heart failure, it was murder." A gasp rippled through the room. Rupert snorted, "Oh, come off it!" But Slack straightened, his brow furrowing. Miss Marple raised a hand. "Let me explain. It began with the teacup, spilled, not dropped, on the night she died. Mrs. Hawthorne was precise. She'd never leave it so. Then Lily heard voices, a man's angry, after 9, when the house was supposedly empty. Lily flinched, but Miss Marple pressed on. The room was locked, key inside, yet someone was there. How? She turned to Slack. "You assumed no one could enter, Inspector, but a key can be turned from outside. with wire, slipped through the keyhole and pulled. Free. I tested it myself on my cottage door. It leaves no trace. Slack's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Miss Marple continued, In the garden I found a glass shard, curved sharp, with a chemical scent. Not a cup, but a vial, broken and hidden. Poison, I thought, colourless, quick. The doctor missed it, assuming age took her. But who used it? Her eyes swept the room. Rupert stood to gain the most, the manor, the land. His spending began too soon. His hands shook with nerves. But the oily smudge on his cuff was motor grease, not poison. He's greedy, not clever enough for this. Rupert bristled, but she moved on. Clara, desperate, bought hats on credit, expecting her share. Yet she'd no access that night. Her temper's loud, not subtle. Mrs. Pym resented her mistress, but scones don't kill. Tom knew something. Drunk, he muttered. But his hands were steady, not guilty. She paused, her gaze settling on Lily. The girl shrank back, trembling. Lily, though. She heard the voices, saw too much. She went to the chemist's, bought something in a panic. And that mark on her wrist, a burn, from a splash of liquid she didn't expect. The room stilled. Lily's eyes widened, her voice a whisper. No, I didn't. You didn't mean to, Miss Marple said gently. But you did. Mrs. Hawthorne was changing her will. Sally at the bakery heard it. She'd cut you all out, perhaps, or give more to the library. You, Lily, knew her habits, her tea, her temper. That night you argued. A man was there, Tom, I think, delivering wood late. You sent him off, but in rage or fear you slipped poison from the scullery into her cup. It spilled when she realized too late. Tom nodded slowly. I was there, heard shouting, left quick. Didn't think, Lily sobbed, collapsing into a chair. She called me useless, said I'd get nothing. I'd saved a bottle, rat poison, from the shed. I just wanted her to stop. Miss Marple sighed. A locked room, a broken vial, a girl pushed too far. You hid the truth, Lily, but it found you out. Slack stepped forward, stunned. Rat poison? Good Lord, I'll need a statement. He glanced at Miss Marple, grudging respect in his eyes. You've done it again. The room erupted, Rupert cursing, Clara gaping, Mrs. Pym clucking in shock. Miss Marple stepped back, her work done. Lily, the overlooked, had snapped a twist no one saw coming. As Slack led her away, Miss Marple picked up her knitting. Justice was served, but the village would talk for years.